It there, Irfan Nuruddin, Leela Jacinto, describing this as a bet. Is it a bet?
Well, what appears to have been the case is both the U.S. and India appears to have learned lessons from this. India, of course, has not condemned Russian aggression in Ukraine. So the Biden administration is keen to get India on camp. Now, if you ask Indian diplomats and experts, why does India still cleave to Russia? They typically say that India, when it makes these defense deals, wants a technology transfer and wants manufacturing in India. And the US typically has offered off-the-shelf arms sales. So it appears that Washington has got that lesson, that there is a technology transfer and manufacturing with this deal. On the other hand, this deal involves Hindustan Aeronautics Limited, which is a state-owned company, and not like what we saw with the French Rafales, which had some of these business leaders with close ties to New Delhi, Ambanis, Adanis. They don't have any, say. They don't really have the expertise of building this. So on both.
So both the United States and France courting India for closer defense ties and defense deals. Earlier, again, on the South Lawn, it was also Joe Biden who spoke. A lot of the diaspora in the United States is pro-Modi, but not all. And he gave passing nod to concerns over religious freedoms and human rights.
Equity under the law, freedom of expression, religious pluralism, and diversity of our people. These core principles have endured and evolved even as they have faced challenges throughout each of our nation's histories, and will fuel our strength, depth, and future.
So Suketu Mehta, the language chosen there by Joe Biden versus that memorandum of understanding on fighter jet engines. What's the message Washington is sending to Delhi?
Well, the message that's being sent with all these deals is that the U.S.-India relationship isn't based on a mutual interest in democracy and the protection of human rights and freedom of expression. It's a transactional relationship based on selling things. And it's deeply alarming. Indian democracy has never been under greater threat. And I know that there are people in the Biden administration, including Biden himself, because I've spoken with them, who are feeling enormous concern about what's happening in India right now. But they can't express it openly because they need India's support to combat the rise of China. And they're hoping that India will come around to the American viewpoint vis-a-vis Ukraine.
Leela Jacinto.
I agree entirely with what Suketu says. And when it comes to this U.S.-India foreign policy, the elephant in the room is China, of course. But on that, the calculation may not work in Washington, D.C.'s favor, because India will conduct its foreign policy according to its own strategic interest. And India and China share a 2,600-kilometer border. The U.S. has already, gone out of Afghanistan, which means the U.S. has to maintain its ties with the Pakistani army. So the fact that somehow India is going to abandon its position on China and jump onto the West camp is sort of not understanding how Delhi operates.
And with due respect, I mean, you referred to Mr. Biden's remarks as a passing nod. I mean, I think you got to really contort that to see this as anything other than actually a defense of Mr. Modi's record at this moment, right? I mean, this is going to get played on news stations across India, not as being a veiled criticism, but in fact an endorsement of the strength of India's democracy, of its record on religious freedom, etc. So Mr. Biden might have been trying to pass words, but I'm afraid that the message will not have landed if that was his intention.
And will also be covered a lot is, of course, the pomp and circumstance of a state visit.
Probably what should have been on the menu is Chinese Premier Xi Jinping. But just to go back to what we were talking about, transactional politics, let's examine the stakes of this. I completely agree with Irfan. This is going to be played very differently in India. The stakes of this is, Biden makes these statements after tremendous pushback. You have three congresswomen who are going to they're not going to be present at his speech in Congress. You have the Indian diaspora, the people who are alarmed about the liberal the backsliding, mobilizing like never before. The stakes of this is, Biden's in some constituencies, certainly in the Muslim world and certainly in the global South, is that Biden's foreign policy is as transactional as Trump's foreign policy. He fist bumped MBS from Saudi Arabia. He's now wooing Narendra Modi with a state visit. In the end, the global South, when it comes to the Ukraine war, does not side with the West because it just sees the hypocrisy of the West. On the one hand, democratic values are talked about but never acted upon. And so, when there is a Ukraine war and then the global North is extremely surprised, that we have not managed to convince anyone, but realpolitik always trumps values and human rights and democratic backsliding, which is now it's actually an electoral autocracy.
Yeah, an electoral autocracy.
That's not me, that's experts who have said that.
Right.
Okay. Then when it comes to the press freedom, for example, because that is intrinsic part of the democracy, of course, when you look at the latest rankings that have come out, would you believe that India is ranked at 161 in the world in press ranking? Afghanistan is ranked at 152. So that actually gives you a lot of doubt about how these press rankings are also worked out.
Suketa Mehta, you're a journalist.
I absolutely am. And with all due respect, the people who compile these rankings, they aren't just making these numbers up. India has slid enormously in press rankings. There's basically no independent television networks left that do not toe the government line. So it's not as if there are government censors which go and censor pieces of news. And yes, there are elections, but the government's been incredibly effective in using the taxation authorities, the enforcement directorate, and the manipulation of financial oligarchs to control the press. So it's not so much a Soviet model as it is a Polish or Hungarian model. The press in India, and I've been working as a journalist in India and America for many decades now, has never been in greater peril. And this is an orchestrated campaign by the party that's ruling the country. So this is Reporters Without Borders. There's a number of internationally recognized organizations that have given these really lamentable rankings to India for press freedom. It's not just the press. The greatest peril is Indian Muslims. There's over 200 million Indian Muslims. And they're systematically being told by the government, this is not your country. This is a Hindu country. This is what the stakes are. We've got to be clear what the stakes are. The BJP and the RSS, which is this non-political paramilitary organization organized along fascist lines that created the BJP, they are clear about their intentions to turn India into a Hindu nationalist state where everyone else lives by Hindu sufferance, including 200 million Indians. What do you think that's going to do? If 200 million Indians are alienated, you'll have a civil war which will make partition seem like a schoolyard brawl.
Okay. Then very briefly, because I think we're going to be interrupted soon by the leaders of the United States and India from the White House. On the whole citizenship law, how much is that going to be coming up in conversation during this state visit?
I don't think at all. I mean, this is a transactional relationship dressed up to be about other things, but I think Mr. Biden has been steadfast in resisting calls to even comment on India's human rights record and democracy. The goal over here is to make sure that every part of this is well scripted and on a single message, which is that the United States and India are going to work with each other in many different dimensions, from technology to trade to defense. China won't come up explicitly, but China is the matchmaker that has arranged this marriage, if you would, and both sides are going to play to their script. And so to expect anything else, I think, would be naive. And frankly, at the end of the day, this is a state visit. This is not the time for that. The die was cast when the invitation for the state visit was made. It was a decision made at the highest level of the American government and implemented by every part of the bureaucracy, that we're not going to talk about the awkward stuff. We're not going to talk about the difficult stuff. And I would argue, frankly, because America doesn't really care about any of that stuff genuinely. The real concern that animates Washington, D.C. is one thing only, which is how to preserve American hegemony for as long as possible. France arguably understands that as well. And so we get to see Mr. Modi feted today and tomorrow over here, and on Bastille Day in Paris. And then in September, we'll host the G20, and then there'll be a Quad summit. All recognize that. And I think we're just getting a pretty tough lesson in just how dominant realpolitik logic works and how superficial many powerful states' commitments to more liberal values is. That, I guess, is the real world.
Okay.
It's unfortunate that we end up having to sacrifice democracy and human rights and all of those other values as, sort of just byproducts of the relationship. I would much rather that both countries just be much more matter of fact and say, this is important strategically. We'd love to sell you very expensive weapons. We'd like to buy your expensive weapons. And we don't have to keep couching it in the language of democracy, because that does damage to those concepts in ways that undermine, for the global South, the credibility of our commitments to those values. And there's something really lost when that dies.
So, Kedameta, you agree, don't talk too much about democracy. Instead, over the long run, that diaspora will be a force for good for both countries, is what we're hearing effectively.
Well, not necessarily, because the diaspora, like India, is also split. There's a section of the diaspora that thinks of Modi as the Gujarati Elvis. They're just besotted with him. And then there's another section of the diaspora, like myself, and especially among younger Indian Americans, who are appalled at what's going on in India and are actively, they're almost like dissidents. I have friends of mine who are journalists who are not allowed to re-enter the country that they were raised in because the government has revoked their overseas citizen of India status. So the diaspora can be a force for good, but right now there's a huge struggle over narrative and about India globally and in the diaspora. Is India a democracy or not? Is India a nation for all its citizens, or is India ultimately that sad thing, a Hindu nationalist state?
There is as well, though, those who say, look, we're not that interested in politics. What we see is that in the past, there was a lot of red tape in India, and we want to see less red tape when we're dealing with U.S.-India ties. So I'm no supporter of the Congress Party, and when they say red tape, they mean socialism. And Modi has had an interesting sort of nativist Indian socialism. There's a huge amount of support for oligarchs, like there's two in particular, Ambani and Adani. And there's an enormous amount of rent-seeking going on in Indian politics, and state support like the licenses to run favored ports and infrastructure. Suketu Mehta, we're just going to cross over to the White House now and listen to India's Prime Minister and the U.S. President.